This was the core of Kane's design. These were not random, desperate attacks. Each event was a precise strike against the logistical and psychological framework of Imperial control. The targets were chosen for maximum disruptive effect, with minimal expenditure of force. A power relay failure here could strand a battalion. A sabotaged irrigation system there could panic a planetary governor. The Imperial war machine, a colossal entity built for frontal assault and overwhelming firepower, began to grind to a halt. Its admirals looked toward the stars for an enemy fleet that would never come, while the true attack unfolded silently in their supply depots, on their comms lines, and in the stomachs of their citizens. Victory would not be seized on a battlefield. It would be delivered through collapsed supply lines and empty stomachs, a much more profound and lasting defeat. The banquet hall hummed with the low, satisfied frequency of unchallenged power. General Kane moved through the glittering assembly of insectoid dignitaries and scaled ambassadors like a cold draft, barely noticed but felt by all. Her path was not random. It was a survey of the Empire's command structure in its most unguarded state. High Marshal Zorv, a Vrex with polished mandibles and rank insignia covering half his carapace, intercepted her near the refreshment table. He held a bubbling blue liquid in a crystalline flute, and his voice carried the tone of a man addressing a particularly interesting museum exhibit. He asked her about the taste of human surrender. He wondered if it was bitter like their medicines or perhaps metallic like blood. He framed it as a philosophical question, a curiosity about a conquered species' psychology. Kane picked up a small iridescent fruit from a passing tray and turned it over in her fingers. She said that for her, surrender tasted like gas station coffee. The Marshal's antennae twitched in genuine confusion. The term meant nothing to him. He understood black hole mechanics and plasma containment, but the concept of a cheap, bitter caffeine solution purchased at a terrestrial refueling station was a complete cultural blank. His confusion was the point. It was a doorway. She explained it was a terrible, burnt liquid consumed out of necessity during long night shifts, a shared experience for billions. It was not about flavor, but endurance. Her words were a deflection, but they were also a probe. By presenting a concept so fundamentally human and mundane, she revealed the vast gulf of understanding the Empire had never bothered to cross. They had studied human military tactics, but never their culture. They knew how humans fought, but not why they endured. This blindness was a vulnerability she could exploit. She spent the next hour in a series of these polite, pointed exchanges. She complimented a Jorvac admiral on the impressive patrol density in the Kirshi Tongjong de Bianjie. He, flattered by her apparent admiration for his fleet's visibility, casually mentioned the regular, predictable maintenance cycles of their long-range sensor platforms. A critical piece of tactical data she filed away. She discussed logistics with a supply corps officer, who boasted about the efficiency of their just-in-time delivery system for anti-matter cores to frontline battle groups. Unaware, he was outlining the Empire's most catastrophic single-point failure. A young, nervous-looking aide from a minor world brushed past her, his scales flushed with a nervous pigment. He muttered a single sentence under the din of conversation, a warning barely audible. He said some people would come to regret this evening. It was not a threat from him, but a fear he was repeating. Kane's expression did not change, but her focus sharpened. Her calm demeanor solidified into something colder, more calculating. That single whisper told her more than a dozen intelligence briefings. It confirmed the fractures were already there, the dissent brewing beneath the glittering surface of Imperial unity. Each handshake, each toast, each fragment of small talk was a transaction. She traded meaningless pleasantries for shield generator schedules. She offered empty compliments in return for troop rotation patterns. The Empire's officers, so confident in their victory, saw only a defeated general making the best of her situation. They never saw the map she was building in her mind, a complete schematic of their defensive arrogance. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation became a cover for the most effective intelligence operation of the war. The banquet was not a social event. It was a battlefield where information was the only weapon that mattered, and every word was a shot fired. By the time the evening began to wane, she had her answer. She knew which officers were blindly loyal, which were boastfully incompetent, and which, like the nervous aide, were already contemplating the unthinkable. She knew which ones would break. In the shadowed service corridors behind the banquet hall, A figure moved with the quiet purpose of a draft finding a crack in a sealed room. He wore the dark data-tech robes of a low-level comms technician, the hood pulled forward to obscure his features in the dim light. His boots made no sound on the polished floor. He was one of dozens, a single courier in a network that stretched across Imperial space, all moving with the same ghost-like precision. His purpose was not to fight, but to connect, to deliver the pieces of a plan too large for any single transmission. He found General Kane standing near a bank of environmental control panels, her posture as still as a statue's. The Imperial guards were 20 meters away, their attention fixed on the grand entrance, their scanner wands tuned to detect energy weapons and explosive compounds. They were looking for obvious threats, for the drama of an assassin's blade or a smuggled pistol. They did not see the man in the robes. He did not stop walking. As he passed her, his head remained bowed, his hands tucked into his sleeves. A single sentence left his lips, a whisper so low it was almost swallowed by the hum of the machinery. Leave the capital tonight. The warning was not a suggestion. It was a status report. Kane did not turn her head. She did not look at the courier. Her eyes remained fixed on a readout screen displaying atmospheric pressure. Her reply was just as quiet, just as final. Regret will matter more in the morning. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. The courier continued down the corridor without breaking stride, vanishing around a corner as if he had never been there. The guards noticed nothing. This man represented a system built on patience and anonymity. Their network did not rely on vulnerable quantum entanglement or traceable laser comms. It operated through physical dead drops. A coded message left beneath a specific rock in a public park, a data chip taped to the back of a restroom mirror in a starport. It used coded advertisements in the public markets of port cities, the kind that advertised cheap transport or used reactor parts. The phrases meant nothing to Imperial patrols, but to a human with the right cipher. They spelled out meeting times, abort signals, and target priorities. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly untraceable form of warfare. The warning the courier delivered was not for Kane's personal safety. She had known the risks for years. It was the final confirmation. Phase 2, the irreversible stage of the operation, was now active. The machinery of collapse was in motion. There would be no calling it back, no standing down. The point of no return had been passed in a whisper. As she absorbed this, her eyes scanned the periphery of the main hall, visible through the archway. She saw the subtle tells now, the small signs of unease she had been trained to identify. A Yorvac admiral checking his personal comm unit too often. A Vrex diplomat whose mandibles clicked together in a nervous rhythm not part of normal conversation. A junior officer whose eyes darted toward the exits. These were not the actions of confident victors. They were the first, almost imperceptible tremors of an establishment that sensed the ground shifting beneath its feet. They called it a moral recalibration. 12 capital cities, 99 million dead in under 7 minutes. The Galactic Federation didn't even call it a war. Now, from inside their victory broadcast, a human general sits among alien dignitaries, her eyes quietly signaling the beginning of their end. This is how you unravel an empire without firing a single shot. Yet, the Ur. Grand hollow chamber echoed with the synchronized clapping of chitinous hands and buzzing thoraxes as Emperor Vorlag stood, illuminated on the holographic stage, his multi-jointed limbs casting long shadows across the assembled alien dignitaries. His amplified voice boomed through the cavernous space, declaring humanity's subjugation complete and their future securely guided by imperial wisdom. He spoke of order, progress, and the benevolent hand of a civilization too advanced to need cruelty. To his audience, this wasn't a broadcast. It was a coronation of their ideology. On massive holoscreens flanking the stage, carefully curated images played on a loop. They showed orderly lines of human prisoners receiving rations, their faces passive, their eyes downcast. The footage was clean, sterile, and utterly dishonest. Every frame had been scrubbed of the screaming mothers on the frontier, the burning homesteads, the children's bodies left in the black soil of outlying colonies. The omission wasn't an oversight. It was the entire point. This narrative of merciful conquest was a tool, designed to pacify not just the humans watching under duress, but also the 100 imperial worlds tuning in, reinforcing the lie that resistance was both futile and immoral. Seated in a place of honor among the high-tier Yorvac and Vrex dignitaries, General Mariana Kane was the only human in the chamber not on a screen. Her presence was a calculated insult, a living trophy placed at the victor's table. She did not fidget. She did not applaud. Her posture remained ramrod straight, her hands resting on her knees, her uniform stark against the iridescent silks and gleaming exoskeletons surrounding her. While alien eyes were fixed on the Emperor's performance, hers were in constant subtle motion. They tracked the positions of the Royal Guard, noted the locations of every comms relay and security panel embedded in the walls, and mapped the sightlines of every weapons emplacement. She was a strategist reading a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. To the Empire, this spectacle was the ultimate expression of their power. They believed they had won through the sheer overwhelming force of their fleets and the unassailable control of the story being told. The applause was their confirmation. The broadcast was their proof. But Kane saw the hollow core of it. She saw the insecurity that required such a lavish performance, the deep-seated fear that their control was as fragile as the light from the holograms. This victory was not their strength. It was their greatest, most exploitable vulnerability. The stage was not set for a lasting peace. It was set for the quietest, most surgical war in galactic history, a war fought not with fleets but with signals, and set to begin the moment the applause died down. As the alien dignitaries raised their frosted goblets in a toast to their own supremacy, a faint vibration registered against General Kane's ribcage. 3 precise pulses spaced half a second apart traveled through the subcutaneous implant buried deep beneath her uniform. The device was a sliver of human engineering, a communications relay that used bone conduction instead of electromagnetic signals. Imperial scanners swept the chamber constantly for illicit transmissions, but they searched for energy signatures, for waves traveling through air. They never thought to check for messages moving silently through human tissue. This was the signal she had waited 7 years to feel. Phase 1 was complete. Across the galaxy, on 100 occupied worlds, the first wave of operatives had reached their positions. They stood ready in maintenance shafts on agricultural moons, in the control rooms of orbital refueling stations, aboard Imperial freighters hauling grain and medical supplies to core worlds. Each team held their position, waiting for the next command. The entire operation, a galaxy-spanning act of coordinated insurgency, now hung on the simple response she had to give. Her face showed nothing. She lifted her own glass in a mirror of the celebration around her, her movements smooth and unhurried. With deliberate control, she tensed a specific muscle group twice in succession, holding each contraction for a full second. 2 long pulses echoed back through the implant's receiver. Phase 2 was ready. The confirmation traveled instantly along a network of identical devices, a chain of silent communication linking every human operative in Imperial space. Her composure in that moment was not merely discipline. It was a weapon more precise and more lethal than any plasma rifle in the chamber. A facade so perfect it became an instrument of war. She turned her head and offered a thin, polite smile to a Jorvac diplomat who was boasting about the new trade routes. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, counting down the seconds until the first systems would begin to fail. This technology represented the core of the human strategy, the fundamental adaptation forced upon them by overwhelming Imperial force. They could not win through direct confrontation, through fleet engagements or artillery barrages. Their victory would be carved from patience, from intelligence, and from the Empire's arrogant blindness to anything it considered primitive. Each of those 3 initial pulses corresponded to a different category of team. 1 pulse for infiltration units hidden aboard Imperial logistical vessels, another for engineering cells positioned at power distribution nodes on key planets, the last for agricultural specialists waiting on the hydroponic stations that fed entire sectors. Their targets were not soldiers or warships. They were the veins and arteries of the Imperial body, the delicate systems that allowed a civilization to believe itself invincible. In a room echoing with the clinking of glasses and the satisfied hum of conquerors, General Kane had just ignited the fuse. The war for liberation began not with a declaration, not with the roar of engines or the flash of orbital cannon, but with a series of vibrations against living flesh, a signal felt by one woman and then by thousands, a tremor that announced the end of an empire, and no one else in the room even felt it. Elsewhere on an Imperial world known as Jorvac Prime, a maintenance supervisor swore as his control panel lit up with a cascade of failure warnings. It was shift change. the precise moment when one crew was logging off and the next had not yet fully assumed their posts. Power relays in Sectors 7 through 12 dropped offline in rapid succession. The supervisor assumed it was a glitch, a faulty batch of Imperial-made components finally giving out. He filed a standard maintenance request and expected a repair drone within the hour. It did not come. This was not an isolated incident. The same pattern repeated across 100 Imperial-held worlds, a synchronized failure of critical systems that began in the exact minute following General Kane's signal. On agricultural moons that supplied grain to core Imperial territories, automated irrigation systems suddenly reversed their programming. Instead of delivering precise amounts of water and nutrient solution, they began flooding fields, drowning entire crops of genetically modified wheat-like stalks essential to the Imperial food supply. Then, just as abruptly, they shut down completely, leaving the remaining plants to wither under artificial suns. The first distress calls spoke of localized technical failures. Then they spoke of impending famine. Meanwhile, in the capital, a human courier with a forged identification chip walked calmly through a service entrance. He carried a plain, worn satchel made of synthetic leather, the kind used by low-level bureaucrats across the Empire. Inside, nestled between a meal bar and a data slate filled with innocuous shipping manifests, were 3 encrypted data cores. Their outer shells were scratched and dusty, indistinguishable from standard geological survey equipment. 3 human scouts had buried these cores weeks earlier in a pre-marked debris field on a moon slated for Imperial mineral exploitation. The courier's job was simply to retrieve the satchel from a dead drop and deliver it to a blind contact within the palace. A task so mundane it was beneath the notice of Imperial security. As the physical sabotage took hold, a digital counterpart unfolded within the Empire's own command networks. False orders, crafted with perfect procedural language and bearing the correct encryption protocols, began threading their way through communication channels. They redirected supply convoys to empty coordinates, canceled routine maintenance on key defense grid emplacements, and reassigned technical crews to non-existent problems. The confusion was immediate and profound. Regional commanders received conflicting reports, each assuming the disruptions were someone else's problem, a local act of sabotage, or perhaps opportunistic looting by disgruntled colonists. They dismissed the scale of it. They looked for a single enemy ship, a concentrated rebel force. They found nothing. The defections started as quiet disappearances so small they were almost missed. A supply ship scheduled for a routine run to a mining colony simply failed to return. Its transponder went dark in deep space. Imperial Command logged it as a mechanical failure, a tragic loss of life and material. They did not know the ship's Jorvac captain and his Vrex navigator were drinking real coffee in a hidden hangar bay, providing human intelligence officers with the access codes to the entire sector's supply network. A communications officer on a border outpost finished her shift, walked out the main gate, and never came back. She took with her the complete frequency rotation schedule for the Imperial fleet's encrypted battle network. These were not dramatic betrayals. They were quiet resignations, carried out by people who had simply had enough. The slow trickle of losses began to accelerate, fueled by the Empire's own paranoia. Each disappearance created a vacuum of trust. Officers who had served together for decades now looked at each other with suspicion. Who would be next? Who was secretly discontent? The Imperial High Command's response was exactly as Kane's strategists had predicted. They began to purge. Loyal, competent officers were suddenly reassigned to meaningless posts or arrested on flimsy, manufactured evidence of disloyalty. The purges were meant to solidify control, to root out the infection. Instead, they spread it. Every good officer removed created 2 more potential defectors. Officers who now saw their own fates reflected in the unjust treatment of their comrades. The Empire, in its fear, was actively dismantling its own command structure. The human offer was not merely an escape. It was a chance at moral clarity after years of being forced to participate in a lie. The emissaries did not promise riches or power. They presented the raw, unedited footage from the frontier settlements. They showed these Imperial officers the children the victory broadcast had airbrushed from history. They showed them the reports that had been classified, the casualty lists that had been falsified. For many, it was the first time they understood the true cost of the Empire's so-called peace. They were not just offered sanctuary, they were offered a chance to atone. What these defectors brought with them was more valuable than any stolen warship or crate of weapons. They brought the Empire's own secrets. They brought the daily changing codes for planetary defense grids. They brought the intimate knowledge of Imperial tactical doctrine, the predictable patterns of thought that governed every admiral's response to a crisis. They brought the personnel files that revealed which commanders were bullies, which were cowards, and which might be persuaded to switch sides next. This insider knowledge allowed human strategists to anticipate every Imperial move, to turn their own protocols against them. The Empire's greatest strength, its vast, interconnected military, was swiftly becoming its primary dissolution vector. A conquest cannot be maintained when the very people tasked with enforcing it begin to question its morality. It cannot function when the conquered, who understand the system's inner workings better than anyone, are invited to become its new architects. The machine of control was now being operated by the very hands it was built to suppress, and those hands were quietly, methodically, switching it off. Across the Empire, the usual propaganda broadcast flickered. The image of Emperor Vorlag, mid-speech about eternal peace, dissolved into a shower of digital static. The screens did not go black. They resolved into a new image, one of stark, grainy clarity. It was footage from a frontier settlement shot from a low angle, shaky and raw. The sky was choked with smoke. In the foreground, children ran, their faces contorted in silent screams as the audio channel flooded with the unmistakable sound of Imperial plasma fire. There was no music, no commentary. Just the horrific, unfiltered reality of the Empire's version of order. Then a voice spoke. It was calm, flat, and carried the weight of a graveside eulogy. They called it victory. The image cut to a close-up of a small body lying in the black soil, half covered by debris. We call it murder. The statement was not shouted. It was delivered as a simple, undeniable fact. The contrast was devastating. The glossy lie of the victory broadcast was replaced by the ugly, pixelated truth of its cost. It was a direct refutation, a moral accusation leveled from within the Empire's own most powerful tool. The effect was immediate and physical. In the mineral processing plants on a dozen mining colonies, workers simply stopped. A Vrex foreman watched in disbelief as his human laborers dropped their heavy tools right on the conveyor belt. The clatter of metal on metal echoed through the cavernous space, a discordant rhythm of protest. They did not riot. They did not chant. They just stood, their eyes fixed on the public viewing screens, their faces hard and still. The work of the Empire ceased. In port towns across occupied space, a different sound took over. The tinny Imperial anthems that usually played from public address systems were suddenly, violently cut off. They were replaced by the deep, slow cadence of a human funeral march. The somber, resonant notes echoed off metal walls and cobblestone streets, rolling through markets and docking bays. Aliens and humans alike stopped their business, looking up at the speakers as if they had turned traitor. The sound was a blanket of grief thrown over the entire town, a constant, audible reminder of what the Empire had done. This was not a simple hijacking of a signal. It was the demolition of an entire narrative. The Empire had built its legitimacy on a story of benevolent conquest, of necessary force for a greater good. That story was now being torn down, brick by brick, on every screen and every speaker it controlled. The very network designed to pacify a galaxy was now its most effective accuser. Workers who had accepted their place, who had never once questioned the official version of events, now saw the evidence with their own eyes. They heard the screams their government had edited out. On the streets of the industrial hub on the edge of Imperial space, a small group of Jorvac loaders, their carapaces dusty from a long shift, began to murmur to each other. Then one of them, his voice rough and unsure, repeated the words from the broadcast. They called it victory. Another joined in. Then another. It was not a cheer. It was a low, spreading rumble of anger and shame. The phrase became a refrain, a password for the disaffected. It spread from person to person, world to world, a virus of truth in a body sick with lies. The moral high ground, so long occupied by the conquerors with their clean uniforms and polished speeches, had been irrevocably taken. The conquered now held it, and their evidence was playing on a loop for the entire galaxy to see. The Empire had lost control of the story, and with it, the war. The council chamber doors hissed open, and General Kane walked into the heart of the storm. The air was thick with the frantic energy of panicked advisors. Holographic feeds flickered around the immense room, showing the same damning evidence that was now playing across the galaxy. Imperial warships changing their transponder codes to declare for the human resistance, agricultural colonies dark and starving, power grids collapsing in perfect unnatural sequence. Emperor Vorlag stood at the center of the chaos, his insectoid frame rigid with fury. He gestured wildly at a cowering technician, his voice a shrill command to cut the feeds to silence the truth at its source. The order was given, but the screens did not go dark. The images of his failing empire continued to play. The system would not obey him. Kane moved through the agitated crowd of alien dignitaries and military leaders. They parted before her, some in confusion, others in dawning fear. She did not hurry. Her steps were measured, her expression as calm as deep space. She stopped before the raised dais where the Emperor stood. A single human figure in a sea of looming, armored forms. She did not raise her voice. She simply spoke, and the chamber fell silent to hear her. "This is General Mariana Caney of the United Terran Fleet." The title landed in the room with the weight of a physical blow. It was a declaration of sovereignty from a people they had declared pacified. The capital's fate had been sealed hours earlier, the moment the victory broadcast began. Every move from this point forward was not improvisation. It was the execution of a choreography planned and rehearsed over 7 long years of occupation. Each step, each response, each countermove had been wargamed in hidden basements and coded transmissions. The Empire was still dancing to the tune of its own triumph, unaware that the music had already stopped and a new score was beginning. As twilight washed the capital's spires in shades of deep violet and cold blue, General Kane stood by a tall window, her attention turned inward. She focused her will, tensing the muscle group controlling the implant buried in her side. 2 rapid pulses, a brief pause, then a single sustained vibration. The signal was deployed. It was not a broadcast. It was a trigger. Across the sprawling empire on 100 occupied worlds, human operatives felt the answering tremor against their skin. On the acidic mining colonies of Xylos, a shift manager leaning over a conveyor belt winced as the vibration registered against his hip bone. In the cavernous maintenance bay of an orbital shipyard, a technician calibrating a thruster array felt the signal through her wrist. On the vast agricultural plains of Viridia, a worker monitoring soil pH levels straightened up as the pulse traveled up his ankle. No device lit up. No alarm sounded. Each person simply stopped what they were doing, their faces blank, their movements suddenly purposeful. The waiting was over. This communication system was the product of brutal necessity. The Empire's technological surveillance was total, its ability to intercept any electronic or quantum signal absolute. So humanity went lower tech. The implants were simple piezoelectric receivers, little more than refined crystals and nerve-conductive filaments. They required no power source, emitted no energy signature, and were undetectable to any scanner the Empire possessed. They could only be activated by one of a handful of pre-programmed sequence generators, devices so simple they were essentially just timed muscle stimulators. The Empire hunted for complex codes and data packets. It never looked for a pattern of pressure against living tissue. Its greatest strength, technological omniscience, became a profound blind spot. The simplicity of the method was its genius. The code traveled through handshakes in crowded mess halls, through brief touches in cargo lift corridors, through the press of a crowd in a marketplace. A courier could deliver the day's vibration to a contact with a firm grip on the shoulder. A mother could pass it to her child with a hug. It was a virus of information spreading through the one medium Imperial security could not quarantine: human contact. It required no hardware that could be confiscated, no software that could be corrupted. It required only patience and trust. Each component of the 3-pulse sequence had a specific meaning. The first 2 short bursts identified the receiving units, maintenance crews on core worlds. The following long pulse designated the action: initiate primary sabotage protocols. On agricultural moons, it meant to commence the flooding sequence. In communications hubs, it signaled the insertion of the prepared data slugs containing the damning frontier footage. For infiltration teams on Imperial warships, it was the order to sever primary power conduits at the next shift change. They had practiced these responses for years in hidden facilities, their movements choreographed down to the second, waiting for the day the Empire's arrogance would provide the perfect cover for their strike. The timing was brutally precise. The signals were synchronized to the imperial capital's chronometric standard, accounting for relativistic time dilation across the star systems with complex mathematical models. An attack that began at the microsecond level on an outer rim mining outpost would coincide perfectly with a power grid failure in a core system light years away. The Empire's own perfectly uniform clock became the metronome for its own dismantling. The galaxy-wide strike did not commence with a declaration of war or the roar of engines. It started as a series of nearly imperceptible vibrations in the wrists and ankles of thousands of ordinary people, a silent drumbeat that heralded the end of an age. The Empire's vast technological superiority had been rendered meaningless by a method it considered too primitive to even notice. On Jorvok Prime, a maintenance drone the size of a man's fist finished its programmed route through a primary power conduit. It was a standard Imperial model, its identification codes flawless, its presence in the deep infrastructure tunnel entirely routine. It paused at a junction box, extended a manipulator arm, and placed a small matte black object no larger than a coin against the main relay housing. There was no flash, no roar, just a dull thump that was swallowed by the hum of the machinery. The explosion was contained, efficient, and perfectly calculated. It vaporized a critical connection node, severing the flow of energy without damaging the surrounding structure. The drone then retracted its arm and continued its patrol as if nothing had happened. The initial failure was localized. A single district in the planetary capital experienced a brownout. Backup systems engaged automatically, rerouting power through secondary conduits. For approximately 8 seconds, the system seemed stable. Then the backups failed. Not all at once, but in a cascading sequence like a row of dominoes falling with precise, terrifying timing. A surge protector here overloaded, a capacitor bank there discharged prematurely. Each failure triggered the next, a chain reaction of engineered collapse. The darkness did not simply spread. It leapt from district to district, then from city to city, until the entire night side of Jorvok Prime was a sprawling map of black. Streetlights, transport grids, residential blocks, and industrial sectors all went silent. The only light came from the stars and the frantic emergency beacons of aircraft suddenly falling from the sky. In the orbital lanes above the planet, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Automated navigation beacons, which relied on planetary power grids for calibration and diagnostics, began to flicker and die. Freighters hauling ore from the system's asteroid belts found their collision avoidance systems dropping offline. A massive Imperial grain carrier, its hold full of food destined for the core worlds, drifted helplessly after its thrusters automatically shut down to prevent a crash it could no longer sense. The shipping lanes, normally thick with traffic and chatter, fell into an unnerving silence. The sector was going blind. Across the Imperial communication networks, the first reports were fragmented and confused. A traffic controller on Jorvok Prime reported a total grid failure. A freighter captain in high orbit sent a panicked message about dead beacons. A mining outpost on a nearby moon lost contact with its headquarters. Each incident was reported in isolation. Each local commander assumed the problem was theirs alone. A technical glitch. A random system collapse in a vast and aging empire. The chaos appeared utterly random, a series of unfortunate coincidences. There was no pattern to suggest a coordinated attack, but to the human operatives who had spent years studying Imperial infrastructure, the pattern was clear as day. Every major failure occurred precisely at a shift change, the 47-minute window where one crew's attention waned, and the next's had not yet fully engaged. Every target was a critical junction, a nexus point where multiple systems interconnected. A power grid here, a comms hub there. The attacks were surgical, striking the Empire's nervous system at its most vulnerable synapses. In one star system, a full Imperial defense grid failed for 11 minutes during a routine simulated drill, leaving an entire battle fleet temporarily blind and deaf, its officers blaming a software bug. The Empire's vast technological body was beginning to shut down, one vital connection at a time. Its limbs were going numb. Its senses were failing. Its brain was receiving confused, contradictory signals from its own extremities. All across occupied space, the vital signs of Imperial control were flatlining. And in the capital, the victory celebration continued unabated, the music and laughter drowning out the first faint cries of a body in systemic failure. The Empire was still boasting of its strength even as its ability to project that strength was disappearing into the dark. In the damp, poorly lit service corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, far from the glittering halls of power, human emissaries began their work. They did not wear uniforms or carry weapons. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who knew the Empire's foundations were already cracking. Their targets were not the high-ranking generals or sycophantic diplomats, but the disgruntled mid-level officers, the overlooked logistics commanders, the communications technicians who had spent years watching the hypocrisy of imperial rule up close. To these individuals, the emissaries offered a simple, radical concept the Empire never could: safety and a genuine choice. It was not a demand for loyalty. It was an invitation to integrity. Human medics worked with methodical efficiency, their focus absolute. They did not distinguish. A Yorvak guard with a shrapnel wound in his carapace received the same careful attention as a human engineer with electrical burns. The medical teams moved between the wounded, their actions speaking louder than any declaration of mercy. It was a practical response to a practical problem, but its effect was profound. The scale of the collapse became apparent not in the shattered walls but in the total failure of the systems meant to respond to such a crisis. Where were the Imperial Medical Corps, the emergency response teams? The structures of governance had not just been defeated. They had dissolved under pressure, revealing a core of bureaucratic rot. Elsewhere, the real work of conquest began. On agricultural worlds where imperial irrigation systems had been sabotaged to cause famine, human engineers were already on the ground. They worked alongside local farmers, bypassing the complex and failing imperial control systems with simple, robust fixes. They restored water flow to parched fields not as overlords but as partners in survival. The threat of starvation, a weapon the Empire had inadvertently turned on its own people, began to recede within hours of the surrender. The power grids followed a similar pattern. As they flickered back online across 100 worlds, they did so with improved routing and efficiency. Human technicians who had spent years studying the Empire's infrastructure solely to find its weaknesses now applied that knowledge to repair and enhance it. The lights came on brighter than before. Citizens of the former Empire experienced a jarring transition. The heavy hand of Imperial tax collectors and security patrols vanished overnight. In their place came human administrators carrying data slates instead of weapons. They assessed damage, took censuses of remaining supplies, and coordinated relief efforts with a quiet competence that was utterly foreign. For many, it was the first effective governance they had experienced in their lifetimes. The Empire's rule had been a burden, a constant extraction of resources and obedience. This new administration focused on restoration and stability. The contrast was undeniable. This was the final, most complete form of victory. True conquest was not the act of taking territory by force and holding it through fear. It was the demonstration of a better alternative. It was proving that your way of organizing society was more resilient, more compassionate, and more competent than the one you replaced. The Empire had fallen not because its armies were destroyed, but because its entire philosophy of power was revealed to be inferior. Humanity's victory was more absolute, its control more deeply rooted precisely because it had been seized through 7 years of meticulous patience rather than in a single brutal outburst of violence. They had not just won the war. They had won the peace that followed. Across 100 worlds, imperial governors awoke to the quietest coup in history. Their authority had not been overthrown. It had evaporated like mist under a sudden sun. The comms links to the capital had gone silent. The daily stream of directives and demands had ceased. Their garrisons reported no enemy fleet arrivals, no troop landings, no declarations of war. There was only a profound and unsettling silence where the machinery of command used to be. They were still in their offices, behind their desks, but the power those positions held was gone. It had been a phantom, sustained only by belief, and that belief had broken. Human emissaries arrived not with warships or soldiers, but with cargo haulers and engineering teams. Their first act was not a demand for surrender, but the distribution of food and medical supplies from their own holds. They bypassed the paralyzed imperial logistics chains entirely. On worlds facing famine because of the sabotaged agricultural systems, these shipments were not just aid. They were a statement. They were proof of a fundamental competence the Empire had lost. Imperial rule had meant extraction. This new presence meant provision. The contrast was not lost on anyone. The transition unfolded with a smoothness that felt almost unnatural to those who lived through it. Former Imperial officers, those who had chosen to defect or simply surrendered, found themselves reporting to human commanders. They expected punishment, degradation, or imprisonment. Instead, they were given tasks. Their expertise in Imperial infrastructure, bureaucracy, and local customs was treated as a valuable asset, not a mark of shame. A Vrex logistics officer who once managed supply lines for an occupation force now found herself coordinating the same supply lines for a relief effort under a human superior who listened to her advice. Her knowledge was the key to restoring order, and it was utilized without prejudice. She was not a prisoner. She was a specialist. This seamless handover was not luck. It was the product of 7 years of meticulous planning. Human intelligence operatives had not just mapped weapons placements and fleet movements. They had created detailed psychological profiles of mid-level Imperial administrators. They knew which officials were pragmatic, which were ideologically rigid, and which were simply waiting for a change in management. They had drafted contingency plans for every sector, every colony, every possible scenario of collapse. When the end came, they did not need to improvise. They pulled the appropriate file and executed the plan. The routines of governance continued. Only the signatures at the bottom of the orders had changed. For the average citizen on a former Imperial world, the change in power was marked by a decrease in disruption, not an increase. The Imperial tax collections had been brutal, predictable events that stripped communities of their resources and often their young people for military conscription. The arrival of human administrators was a quiet affair. They conducted censuses, assessed damage, and began repairs. Life for many became more stable, not less. The crushing weight of Imperial tribute was lifted. The constant fear of the security patrols faded away. The transition felt less like a violent conquest and more like a change in management after the old company went bankrupt. True power, the kind that endures, does not shift through explosions alone. It shifts through the demonstrated capacity to do the job better than the previous administration. The Empire had ruled through fear and spectacle. Humanity secured its victory through logistics, administration, and a quiet, relentless competence. They proved they could keep the lights on, the water flowing, and the food arriving. They turned the Empire's own bureaucrats into their most effective instruments of control. The galaxy learned a terrifying and profound lesson that day. The most devastating weapon is not a planet-killer missile. It is a well-run office, a reliable supply line, and the ability to get things done. Humanity's genius was not for destruction. It was, and always had been, for administration. The conflict did not fade into history. It became a textbook. In military academies across the reclaimed territories and beyond, instructors now pull down holographic schematics of the Imperial collapse. They do not study famous fleet maneuvers or grand artillery barrages. They study timelines. They analyze the precise sequence of logistical failures, the pattern of communication breakdowns, and the psychological impact of the hijacked broadcasts. The curriculum focuses on a new form of warfare, one where the primary weapons are not missiles but signals, not bombs, but information. Students learn how a seemingly primitive technology, a subcutaneous implant using bone conduction, circumvented the most advanced surveillance network in the galaxy. They study how the Empire's own infrastructure, its power grids and agricultural systems, were turned against it with surgical precision. The lesson is not about building a bigger warship. It is about finding the single critical pressure point in an enemy civilization and applying steady, patient force. The Empire's overwhelming technological advantage became irrelevant. Its understanding of its own systems was superficial. Humanity's was absolute. She began to list the crimes. She did not shout accusations. She recited facts with the dispassionate precision of a forensic auditor reviewing a ledger. She named the settlements, not by their imperial designations but by the names their founders had given them. She detailed the specific weapons used against unarmed populations, quoting the imperial procurement codes and the deployment orders. She cited the exact clauses of the Galactic Accords the Empire had violated, the treaties it had sworn to uphold. Each point was a hammer strike, each fact a nail in the coffin of the imperial narrative. Her voice remained level, a stark, chilling contrast to the Emperor's growing agitation. His mandibles clicked together in a furious rhythm, a tell of pure, unadulterated rage. Then she revealed her deepest knowledge. She described the Emperor's personal security protocols, the timing of the guard rotations outside his private chambers, the emergency evacuation route reserved only for the highest tier of the imperial family. She spoke of things no human should have ever known, secrets buried under layers of encryption and blood oaths. This knowledge was more terrifying to the Council than any army. It proved their defenses were not just breached. They were transparent. They had been observed, studied, and mapped from the inside for years. The broadcast of their collapse continued to play on every screen, a visual proof that their attempts to shut it down were useless. Another system, this one controlling internal communications, had been compromised. They had lost control of their own house. She was not speaking only to them. She turned slightly, addressing the holographic recorders she knew were still transmitting. Her words were for every miner on a distant rock, every farmer on an occupied world, every imperial soldier hearing the truth for the first time. "You killed our children," she said, her voice finally acquiring an edge, a sliver of ice. "You called it victory." She let the words hang in the air, let the images on the screens provide the evidence. The chamber was utterly still, every eye fixed on her. Today humanity answers. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. In that moment, the confession of their crimes, dragged into the light by their own technology, became a summons to judgment. The victim was no longer pleading. She was presiding. The Emperor was still reeling from her words, his composure shattered when Kane's thumb pressed a sequence of memorized pressure points against her leg. It was not a button. It was a pattern of muscle memory, a code sent through her body to the implant. The command traveled on a path no Imperial scanner could ever trace. High above the palace, the multi-layered energy shield that protected the most secure location in the galaxy flickered. It did not fail completely. It stuttered, a barely perceptible fluctuation in its humming field. The gap lasted for precisely 47 seconds, the exact duration of a standard Imperial maintenance diagnostic cycle. To anyone monitoring, it would look like a routine system check. It was, in fact, a meticulously planned invitation. In that 47-second window, the blackness of space near the orbital shipyards shimmered. Dozens of human boarding craft, their surfaces coated in sensor-absorbent material and their drives running on a fraction of their power, drifted through the temporary breach. Their engines were virtually silent, their heat signatures dampened to match the background radiation of space. They were inside the Empire's ultimate defensive perimeter, before the shield re-solidified behind them, sealing them in. They did not announce their presence with battle cries or roaring thrusters. They moved with the quiet lethality of a virus entering a bloodstream. The first sign of their arrival was not a sight, but a sound, the sudden coordinated eruption of plasma fire from within the shipyards themselves. The human craft had attached themselves to the outer hulls of Imperial destroyers and carriers, their boarding tubes punching through airlocks with surgical precision. Their targets were not the crews. They targeted the ship's primary power conduits and weapon hardpoints, disabling them with focused, localized strikes. Across the sprawling orbital facility, Imperial warships that moments before had been symbols of invincible power suddenly went dark, their running lights extinguished, their engines dead. The Empire's own fleet was being systematically disarmed from within its own secure dock. On the palace grounds below, the response was immediate and chaotic. Squads of Imperial Royal Guards in gleaming armor poured from their barracks, their heavy plasma rifles seeking targets. They found none. The human forces were already among them, having entered through service tunnels and maintenance accesses mapped years in advance. The guards, trained for frontal assaults and riot control, were completely unprepared for an enemy that struck from the shadows and then melted away. They fell to precise single shots from silenced weapons, to drone-deployed neural disruptors, to close-quarters takedowns executed in the narrow corridors between the palace's grand halls. The fighting was not a battle. It was a clinical dissection of a security force. The human soldiers advanced with a purpose that went beyond tactics. They moved with the moral certainty of those who had seen the evidence, who knew exactly what this empire had done in the name of order. This certainty bred a terrifying patience. They did not fire indiscriminately. They bypassed unarmed staff and surrendering officials. They only engaged those who presented a direct threat, and they did so with a swift, brutal efficiency that left no room for heroics. They targeted control rooms, communication hubs, and generator facilities, seizing the palace's vital organs one by one. The Empire's technological superiority meant nothing. Their sensor grids were blind to an enemy that knew all their default settings and calibration flaws. Their automated turrets were neutralized by codes provided by defectors. Their fortified doors swung open for technicians wearing stolen uniforms and reciting the correct daily passwords. The most secure location in the galaxy, a fortress designed to withstand a direct assault from a full battle fleet, fell in less time than it took the Empire to pacify a single undefended frontier outpost. The lesson was clear. True superiority does not lie in who has the bigger guns or the stronger shields. It lies in who understands the enemy's systems better than they do themselves, and who knows exactly which wires to cut. The palace was a sculpture of controlled chaos. Alarms blared in some sectors while others lay in an unnerving silence, the fighting already over. In the heart of it, General Kane stood before Emperor Vorlag, his carapace seeming to shrink under the weight of the moment. She did not gloat. She did not threaten. She offered a simple, stark bargain. Lay down all arms. Stand down every fleet across Imperial space. Release every human prisoner from detention camps and labor facilities. Do it or face total annihilation. The choice was absolute. She forced him to look past the hollow pageantry of his victory and confront the tangible consequences of his failure. Her terms were not vague demands. They were a precise schedule of surrender. Prisoner releases were to commence immediately and be completed within 24 standard hours. Fleet commanders were to receive and confirm stand-down orders within 48. She was not negotiating for territory or resources. She was dictating terms for the preservation of life, measuring power not in the number of stars controlled, but in the number of lives that would be spared or lost based on his next decision. To her, this was the only arithmetic that mattered. The Emperor hesitated. His multifaceted eyes scanned the room, looking for a salvation that would not come. A lifetime of believing in his civilization's inherent technological superiority was a difficult instinct to override. He still saw the situation as a temporary setback, a problem of tactics and firepower that his remaining loyal forces could eventually solve. He started to form a reply, a refusal built on that old arrogant foundation. Kane did not argue. She simply raised her hand and gestured to the main holographic display, which was still under her control. The image shifted from the damning footage of the frontier to a real-time tactical map of the space surrounding the capital. It showed the positions of his home fleet, the proud defenders of the core worlds, and it showed them completely surrounded. Dozens of new icons glowed with the identification codes of defected Imperial vessels, their weapons locked on their former comrades. They had not just switched sides. They had taken up perfect tactical positions, boxing the Loyalist ships in with an expertise that could only come from insider knowledge. The Emperor's own navy was now his prison warden. Before he could process this, the display split again. It began to show live feeds from Imperial colonies across the galaxy. On screen after screen, the Imperial banner was being torn down from government buildings. In town squares, crowds of various alien species, emboldened by the human broadcasts and the crumbling authority, were raising makeshift flags of autonomy. Planetary governors were publicly announcing their system's neutrality, effectively switching allegiance in the face of the Empire's obvious collapse. His dominion was not just being attacked, it was evaporating, its subjects choosing a new reality without him. The cost of power was being recalibrated in front of him, its value plummeting from territorial control to simple survival. His fleets were useless. His colonies were abandoning him. His capital was occupied. The abstract concept of total annihilation she had threatened was no longer an abstract concept. It was the logical, mathematical conclusion of his current trajectory. In that moment, the Emperor understood the true nature of her weapon. It was mercy. The offer to stop, to spare what remained, was the one strategy his worldview had never accounted for. For an empire that understood only force, the offer of a conditional peace was the ultimate, most devastating form of it. To refuse was to choose oblivion for his entire species. To accept was to admit that his entire philosophy of power had been a fatal error. The weapon was not pointed at his head. It was a door he had to choose to walk through. The final layer of orbital defense flickered and died, its energy signature collapsing into static. On the main display, The last loyal Imperial warship powered down its weapons, its surrender signal blinking across the tactical plot. The fight was over. In the sudden quiet of the command center, General Kane turned to face the Emperor. His carapace seemed duller now, the iridescent sheen gone, replaced by the flat color of defeat. She did not smile. She did not posture. She simply looked at him and spoke the words that would echo across history. "You took our children." Her voice was flat, a statement of established fact. The air in the room went still. "Now we take your—" Her sentence trailed off. She left it hanging in the silence between them, an open circuit waiting to be completed. The tension in the chamber became a physical thing. That unfinished thought was more potent, more terrifying than any explicit threat of destruction or imprisonment could ever be. It was a void, and into that void rushed every possible fear of the Imperial psyche. Would humanity take their territory? Their technology? Their pride? Their entire history? Their right to exist as a sovereign power? By not naming it, she threatened all of it at once. The ambiguity was a weapon, forcing the Emperor and his surviving council to confront the sum total of their own crimes and imagine the price. A specified punishment could be endured, quantified, and perhaps even resisted. An unknown consequence was a perpetual fear, a psychological siege with no definable end. This deliberate silence signaled something far greater than a simple military defeat. It announced a fundamental reordering of galactic power. The old rules, where the Empire dictated terms from a position of unchallenged strength, were gone. The Emperor understood this on a visceral level. His multifaceted eyes scanned her impassive face, searching for a clue and finding none. He finally comprehended that the terms of peace, the shape of the future, would not be negotiated. They would be defined solely by humanity. The victor was not just claiming spoils. They were defining a new reality, and he was in no position to argue its boundaries. A sharp crack echoed through the room as the great Imperial crest mounted above the main viewer shattered. The polished stone, inlaid with precious metals, could not withstand the subtle vibrations from the ongoing structural shifts in the palace. It fractured into 100 pieces, raining down on the control panels below. The sound was like a punctuation mark. It was the sound of toppled arrogance, a symbol of an era breaking under its own weight. In its place stood the quiet, unyielding presence of the human general, a living symbol of a different kind of power. Humanity's resilience, forged in the fires of genocide and honed by years of silent preparation, was no longer just a trait. It had become a galactic constant, a new law of physics as undeniable as gravity. They had been tested to the brink of extinction and had not broken. Instead, they had learned, adapted, and ultimately turned their enemies' greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. Their victory was so absolute, their control so complete, that announcing its final form felt redundant. The era of Imperial dominance did not end with the dramatic explosion of a flagship or the signing of a treaty on a battered hull. It ended with an ellipsis, a trailing thought, a statement deliberately left open. Some victories are too total, their implications too vast, to require a final declarative period. The silence itself is the declaration. The future is whatever we say it is. The immense broadcast arrays that had spent decades projecting Imperial glory across 100 worlds now hummed with a new frequency. The same Jorvac technicians who had carefully edited footage to show smiling human collaborators now sat at their consoles under quiet human supervision, splicing together very different reels. Their multi-jointed hands, once so precise in their deception, now worked to assemble the raw, unvarnished truth. They were not forced. They were shown the unedited archives, the footage from the frontier their own government had classified, and a silent understanding passed between conqueror and conquered. The machine of lies was being retooled, its immense power redirected toward a single purpose: the amplification of human truth. On 100 colony worlds, the workers who had operated the propaganda machines experienced a profound reversal of reality. The Vrex audio engineer who had layered triumphant music over images of burning homesteads now sat before a microphone, his voice low and steady as he narrated the true sequence of events at the Battle of Serenity Point. The human graphic artist who had been forced to airbrush corpses from victory images now used her skills to create timelines, detailing Imperial war crimes with forensic clarity. They were not just broadcasting information. They were bearing witness. They were telling the stories they had been ordered to suppress, and in the telling, they were dismantling their own past compliance, the The psychological effect on the populations was total, a form of collective whiplash. The narrative that had defined galactic politics for a generation, imperial destiny, benevolent conquest, necessary force, was being systematically erased and replaced in real time. Citizens on core worlds watched their holoscreens in stunned silence, as the triumphant parades they had seen yesterday were followed by footage from the same event, now showing the Imperial Guards firing into a crowd of unarmed protesters just outside the camera's previous frame. The experience was deeply destabilizing. If that victory was a lie, what else had been fabricated? The very foundation of their understood reality began to crumble. Many began to doubt the Imperial victory had ever been real, wondering if the entire war had been a prolonged fiction. The new broadcasts were meticulously constructed to maximize this cognitive shift. They did not simply show Imperial atrocities. They paired them. A segment detailing the bombing of a human hospital would be immediately followed by footage of human medics providing aid to wounded Imperial soldiers on another world. A report on Imperial supply depots hoarding food would cut to scenes of human engineers restoring agricultural systems on starving colonies. The contrast was the argument. The narrative was no longer about destiny or racial superiority. It was about simple, stark choices. It was about moral accountability. The Empire had chosen destruction. Humanity was choosing reconstruction. The colonies lived through a week where every morning brought a new inversion of the previous day's truth. Yesterday's heroes were today's war criminals. Yesterday's terrorist attacks were today's desperate acts of self-defense. The constant, reliable drone of Imperial propaganda was gone, replaced by a rolling tide of uncomfortable, undeniable facts. The most powerful weapon in the conflict had never been the plasma artillery or the star destroyers. It was the control of the story. The entity that could define reality, that could dictate what was true and what was false, held the ultimate strategic advantage. They could win the war before the first soldier ever fired a shot, simply by ensuring that when the shooting started, one side believed it was right, and the other knew, in its heart, that it was wrong. The victor would be whoever owned the truth. Silence filled the capital, thick and heavy, broken only by the low hum of emergency generators and the distant calls of human medics moving through the rubble. General Kane walked through the grand promenade, her boots scuffing against a torn Imperial banner trampled into the dust. The damage she surveyed was not from orbital bombardment or artillery barrages. It was structural. Conduits hung from shattered ceilings where control panels had been ripped out. The air smelled of ozone and spilled coolant. This was the aftermath of a war fought in server rooms and power junctions, a victory achieved without a single fleet engagement in orbit. The cost was measured in broken systems, not in craters. The Imperial collapse is now the premier case study in systemic vulnerability. War colleges run simulation after simulation, trying to replicate Kane's strategy against 100 different hypothetical enemies. The focus is always the same. They are not wargaming fleet deployments or infantry assaults. They are modeling supply chain interdiction, cultural subversion, and the seizure of narrative control. The goal is to achieve victory before the first official declaration of war is ever made, to win the conflict in the preparation phase, making the actual fighting a mere formality, a mop-up operation against a foe already paralyzed. This approach redefines the very nature of power. It demonstrates that true strategic dominance does not come from the ability to deliver the most force, but from possessing a deeper, more intimate understanding of the enemy's ecosystem than they possess themselves. It is the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel. The sledgehammer announces its intention with a roar and meets resistance with brute strength. The scalpel moves silently, finds the spaces between the bones, and severs the connections that allow the body to function. The Empire was a sledgehammer. Humanity proved to be a scalpel. The ultimate weapon in this new template was not a device or a doctrine, but a trait: patience. Humanity's 7-year preparation, their willingness to endure occupation and study their enemy with meticulous, silent focus, proved more devastating than any Imperial dreadnought or planetary shield. They did not rush. They did not lash out in desperation. They observed, they planned, and they waited for the perfect moment when the Empire's arrogance would make it blind to the threat growing within its own body. Their victory was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was the inevitable result of a pressure applied slowly, consistently, and with perfect knowledge over a long period of time. The Empire fell because it believed in swift, decisive force. It was defeated by the quiet, relentless application of understanding. And so, General Kane's sentence hangs in the air of the new galactic era, an unfinished thought that echoes through every reconstructed corridor and repurposed shipyard. She had stood before a broken emperor and laid out the terms of his surrender, but she never completed the final clause. Now we take your... The words trail off into a silence more potent than any threat. This is not an omission. It is a strategy. Across the former empire, the question defines the new reality. What will humanity claim as its due? Will it annex territory, carving up imperial space into new sectors under Terran flags? Will it seize technology, confiscating the advanced drives and weapons that once subjugated them, turning the tools of oppression into instruments of their own security? Or is the prize something less tangible, more devastating? Is it pride? Is it the right to dictate history? To ensure the Empire's name is forever synonymous with atrocity and failure? The question hangs over every interaction, a ghost at the table of galactic politics. This deliberate ambiguity functions as a permanent, low-grade deterrent. Imperial remnants, the scattered fleets and planetary garrisons that surrendered but still nurse old loyalties, are frozen in a state of calculation. They cannot plan a resistance because they do not know what form the retaliation will take. A move to reclaim a symbolic world might prompt humanity to erase their cultural archives. An attempt to hide advanced technology might result in the permanent dismantling of their military caste. Each faction, each former governor, each disgraced admiral is left to imagine their own worst-case scenario. They are paralyzed by 1,000 different fears, each one tailored by their own conscience and their own understanding of what they owe. The uncertainty becomes a self-regulating mechanism. It forces introspection. It makes every potential act of defiance a gamble with unknown and potentially catastrophic stakes. There is no clear line to cross, no defined list of prohibited actions. There is only the chilling void of that unfinished sentence, a void that each former imperial must fill with their own apprehension. The cost of resistance is not defined, and therefore it is infinite. Some weapons are too powerful to ever sheathe. A declared threat can be analyzed, countered, or bravely endured. An unstated one evolves, growing in the mind of the opponent, adapting to their specific weaknesses and secret shames. It requires no maintenance, no patrols, no energy to sustain. It is a psychological fixture as permanent as gravity. By refusing to answer the question, humanity retains a perpetual strategic advantage. They hold all possible responses in reserve, a complete arsenal of consequences that need never be fired. The victor does not need to announce the terms of the new world. The silence itself is the terms. The power lies not in what is taken, but in the lingering, unspoken question of what could be. The Empire celebrated a triumph that never was. They mistook surrender for defeat, occupation for control. Their victory was a phantom, and its celebration became the prelude to their own undoing. Humanity's strength was never in matching their firepower. It was in a deeper resilience, forged in loss and honed by patience. They understood that true power isn't held by the fist but by the will. The lesson echoes across the stars now. What appears to be weakness is often just patience gathering its strength for the moment when everything changes.